This is a continuation of The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain, comprising chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17, Foo-Foo the First. Miles Hendon hurried along toward the Southwark end of the bridge, keeping a sharp lookout for the persons he sought, and hoping and expecting to overtake them presently. He was disappointed in this, however. By asking questions, he was enabled to track them part of the way through Southwark. Then all traces ceased, and he was perplexed as to how to proceed. Still, he continued his efforts as best he could during the rest of the day. Nightfall found him leg-weary, half-famished, and his desire as far from accomplishment as ever, so he supped at the Tabard Inn and went to bed, resolved to make an early start in the morning and give the town an exhaustive search. As he lay thinking and planning, he presently began to reason thus. The boy would escape from the ruffian, his reputed father, if possible. Would he go back to London and seek his former haunts? No, he would not do that. He would avoid recapture. What then would he do? Never having had a friend in the world or a protector until he met Miles Hendon, he would naturally try to find that friend again, provided the effort did not require him to go toward London and danger. He would strike for Hendon Hall, that is what he would do, for he knew Hendon was homeward bound, and there he might expect to find him. Yes, the case was plain to Hendon. He must lose no more time in Southwark, but move at once through Kent, toward Monk's Holm, searching the wood and inquiring as he went. Let us return to the vanished little king now. The ruffian whom the waiter at the inn on the bridge saw about to join the youth and the king did not exactly join them, but fell in close behind them and followed their steps. He said nothing. His left arm was in a sling and he wore a large green patch over his left eye. He limped slightly and used an oaken staff as a support. The youth led the king a crooked course through Southwark, and by struck into the high road beyond. The king was irritated now, and said he would stop here. It was Hendon's place to come to him, not his to go to Hendon. He would not endure such insolence. He would stop where he was. The youth said, "Dash, dash. Thou'lt tarry here, and thy friend lying wounded in the wood yonder? So be it then." The king's manner changed at once. He cried out, "Dash, dash. Wounded? And who hath dared to do it? But that is apart. Lead on, lead on. Faster, sirrah. Art shod with lead? Wounded is he? Now though the doer of it be a duke's son, he shall rue it." It was some distance to the wood, but the space was speedily traversed. The youth looked about him, discovered a bough sticking in the ground, with a small bit of rag tied to it, then led the way into the forest, watching for similar boughs and finding them at intervals. They were evidently guides to the point he was aiming at. By and by an open place was reached, where were the charred remains of a farmhouse, and near them a barn which was falling to ruin and decay. There was no sign of life anywhere, and utter silence prevailed. The youth entered the barn, the king following eagerly upon his heels. No one there. The king shot a surprised and suspicious glance at the youth and asked, "Where is he?" A mocking laugh was his answer. The king was in a rage in a moment. He seized a billet of wood and was in the act of charging upon the youth when another mocking laugh fell upon his ear. It was from the lame ruffian who had been following at a distance. The king turned and said angrily, "Who art thou? What is thy business here?" "Leave thy foolery," said the man, "and quiet thyself. My disguise is none so good that thou canst pretend thou knowest not thy father through it." "Thou art not my father, I know thee not. I am the king. If thou hast hid my servant, find him for me, or thou shalt sup sorrow for what thou hast done." John Canty replied in a stern and measured voice, "It is plain thou art mad, and I am loath to punish thee, but if thou provoke me, I must. Thy prating doth no harm here, where there are no ears that need to mind thy follies. Yet it is well to practice thy tongue to wary speech, that it may do no hurt when our quarters change. I have done a murder, and may not tarry at home, neither shalt thou, seeing I need thy service. My name is changed for wise reasons. It is Hobbs, John Hobbs. Thine is Jack. Charge thy memory accordingly. Now then speak. Where is thy mother? Where are thy sisters? They came not to the place appointed. Knowest thou whither they went?" The king answered sullenly, Trouble me not with these riddles. My mother is dead, my sisters are in the palace." The youth nearby burst into a derisive laugh, and the king would have assaulted him, but Canty, or Hobbs, as he now called himself, prevented him and said, "Peace, Hugo, vex him not. His mind is astray, and thy ways fret him. Sit thee down, Jack, and quiet thyself. Thou shalt have a morsel to eat anon." Hobbs and Hugo fell to talking together in low voices, and the king removed himself as far as he could from their disagreeable company. He withdrew into the twilight of the farther end of the barn, where he found the earthen floor bedded a foot deep with straw. He lay down here, drew straw over himself in lieu of blankets, and was soon absorbed in thinking. He had many griefs, but the minor ones were swept almost into forgetfulness by the supreme one, the loss of his father. To the rest of the world, the name of Henry VIII brought a shiver, and suggested an ogre whose nostrils breathed destruction, and whose hand dealt scourgings and death. But to this boy the name brought only sensations of pleasure. The figure it invoked wore a countenance that was all gentleness and affection. He called to mind a long succession of loving passages between his father and himself, and dwelt fondly upon them, his unstinted tears attesting how deep and real was the grief that possessed his heart. As the afternoon wasted away, the lad, wearied with his troubles, sank gradually into a tranquil and healing slumber. After a considerable time, he could not tell how long, his senses struggled to a half-consciousness, and as he lay with closed eyes vaguely wondering where he was and what had been happening, he noted a murmurous sound, the sullen beating of rain upon the roof. A snug sense of comfort stole over him, which was rudely broken, the next moment, by a chorus of piping cackles and coarse laughter. It startled him disagreeably, and he unmuffled his head to see whence this interruption proceeded. A grim and unsightly picture met his eye. A bright fire was burning in the middle of the floor, at the other end of the barn, and around it, and lit weirdly up by the red glare, lolled and sprawled the motliest company of tattered gutter scum and ruffians, of both sexes, he had ever read or dreamed of. There were huge, stalwart men, brown with exposure, long-haired and clothed in fantastic rags. There were middle-sized youths, of truculent countenance and similarly clad. There were blind mendicants with patched or bandaged eyes, crippled ones with wooden legs and crutches, diseased ones with running sores peeping from ineffectual wrappings. There was a villain-looking peddler with his pack, a knife grinder, a tinker, and a barber surgeon, with the implements of their trades. Some of the females were hardly grown girls, some were at prime, some were old and wrinkled hags, and all were loud, brazen, foul-mouthed, and all soiled and slatternly. There were 3 sore-faced babies. There were a couple of starveling curs with strings about their necks, whose office was to lead the blind. The night was come. The gang had just finished feasting. An orgy was beginning. The can of liquor was passing from mouth to mouth. A general cry broke forth. A song from the Bat and Dick and Dot and Go One!" One of the blind men got up and made ready by casting aside the patches that sheltered his excellent eyes and the pathetic placard which recited the cause of his calamity. Dot and Go One disencumbered himself of his timber leg and took his place upon sound and healthy limbs beside his fellow rascal. Then they roared out a rollicking ditty and were reinforced by the whole crew at the end of each stanza in a rousing chorus. By the time the last stanza was reached, the half-drunken enthusiasm had risen to such a pitch that everybody joined in and sang it clear through from the beginning, producing a volume of villainous sound that made the rafters quake. These were the inspiring words, dash, dash, dash. Bien Darkmans then, Bowsmore and Ken, the Bien Coves bings awast, on shates to trine by Rome. Coves dine for his long lib at last. Binged out Bien Moors and Toure, bing out of the Rome vile bine, and tour the cove that cloyed your duds upon the chates to trine. From The English Rogue, London, 1665. Conversation followed, not in the thieves' dialect of the song, for that was only used in talk when unfriendly ears might be listening. In the course of it, it appeared that John Hobbs was not altogether a new recruit, but had trained in the gang at some former time. His later history was called for, and when he said he had accidentally killed a man, considerable satisfaction was expressed. When he added that the man was a priest, he was roundly applauded and had to take a drink with everybody. Old acquaintances welcomed him joyously, and new ones were proud to shake him by the hand. He was asked why he had tarried away so many months. He answered, "London is better than the country, and safer these late years. The laws be so bitter and so diligently enforced, and I had not had that accident. I had stayed there. I had resolved to stay, and never more venture country wards, but the accident has ended that." He inquired how many persons the gang numbered now. The ruffler, or chief, answered, 25 sturdy budges, bulks, files, clapperdogins and maunders, counting the dells and doxies and other morts. Most are here, the rest are wandering eastward along the winter lay. We follow at dawn. I do not see the wen among the honest folk about me. Where may he be? Poor lad, his diet is brimstone now, and over hot for a delicate taste. He was killed in a brawl, somewhere about midsummer. I sorrow to hear that. The wen was a capable man, and brave. That was he, truly. Black Bess his dell is of us yet, but absent on the eastward tramp, a fine lass of nice ways and orderly conduct, none ever seeing her drunk above 4 days in the 7. She was ever strict, I remember it well, a goodly wench and worthy all commendation. Her mother was more free and less particular, a troublesome and ugly-tempered beldame, but furnished with a wit above the common. We lost her through it. Her gift of palmistry and other sorts of fortune-telling begot for her at last a witch's name and fame. The law roasted her to death at a slow fire. It did touch me to a sort of tenderness to see the gallant way she met her lot, cursing and reviling all the crowd that gaped and gazed around her, whilst the flames licked upward toward her face, and catched her thin locks, and crackled about her old grey head, cursing them. Why, an thou shouldst live 1,000 years, thou'dst never hear so masterful a cursing. Alack, her art died with her. There be base and weakling imitations left, but no true blasphemy. The ruffler sighed. The listeners sighed in sympathy. A general depression fell upon the company for a moment, for even hardened outcasts like these are not wholly dead to sentiment, but are able to feel a fleeting sense of loss and affliction at wide intervals and under peculiarly favoring circumstances, as in cases like to this, for instance, when genius and culture depart and leave no heir. However, a deep drink all round soon restored the spirits of the mourners. "Have any others of our friends fared hardly?" asked Hobbs. "Some, yes, particularly newcomers, such as small husbandmen turned shiftless and hungry upon the world because their farms were taken from them to be changed to sheep ranges. They begged, and were whipped at the cart's tail, naked from the girdle up till the blood ran, then set in the stocks to be pelted. They begged again, were whipped again, and deprived of an ear. They begged a third time. Poor devils, what else could they do? And were branded on the cheek with a red-hot iron, then sold for slaves. They ran away, were hunted down, and hanged. 'Tis a brief tale, and quickly told. Others of us have fared less hardly. Stand forth, yokel, Burns, and Hodge, show your adornments." These stood up and stripped away some of their rags, exposing their backs, crisscrossed with ropey old welts left by the lash. One turned up his hair and showed the place where a left ear had once been. Another showed a brand upon his shoulder, the letter V, and a mutilated ear. The third said, "I am yokel, once a farmer and prosperous, with loving wife and kids. Now am I somewhat different in estate and calling, and the wife and kids are gone. Mayhap they are in heaven, mayhap in the other place. But the kindly God be thanked, they bide no more in England. My good old blameless mother strove to earn bread by nursing the sick. One of these died. The doctors knew not how, so my mother was burnt for a witch, whilst my babes looked on and wailed. English law, up all with your cups, now all together and with a cheer. Drink to the merciful English law that delivered her from the English hell. Thank you, mates, one and all. I begged from house to house, I and the wife, bearing with us the hungry kids, but it was crime to be hungry in England. So they stripped us and lashed us through 3 towns. Drink ye all again to the merciful English law. For its lash drank deep of my Mary's blood, and its blessed deliverance came quick. She lies there in the potter's field, safe from all harms, and the kids, well, whilst the law lashed me from town to town, they starved. Drink, lads, only a drop to the poor kids, that never did any creature harm. I begged again, begged for a crust, and got the stalks and lost an ear. See, here bides the stump. I begged again, and here is the stump of the other to keep me minded of it. And still I begged again, and was sold for a slave. Here on my cheek under this stain, if I washed it off, ye might see the red S the branding iron left there. A slave. Do you understand that word? An English slave. That is he that stands before ye. I have run from my master, and when I am found, the heavy curse of heaven fall on the law of the land that hath commanded it. I shall hang. A ringing voice came through the murky air. Thou shalt not, and this day the end of that law is come. All turned, and saw the fantastic figure of the little king approaching hurriedly. As it emerged into the light and was clearly revealed, a general explosion of inquiries broke out. "Who is it? What is it? Who art thou, mannikin?" The boy stood unconfused in the midst of all those surprised and questioning eyes, and answered with princely dignity, "I am Edward, King of England." A wild burst of laughter followed, partly of derision and partly of delight in the excellence of the joke. The king was stung. He said sharply, "Dash, dash. Ye mannerless vagrants, is this your recognition of the royal boon I have promised?" He said more with angry voice and excited gesture, but it was lost in a whirlwind of laughter and mocking exclamations. John Hobbs made several attempts to make himself heard above the din, and at last succeeded, saying, "Mates, he is my son, a dreamer, a fool, and stark mad. Mind him not, he thinketh he is the king." "I am the king," said Edward, turning toward him. "As thou shalt know to thy cost in good time, thou hast confessed a murder, thou shalt swing for it. Thou'lt betray me, thou, and I get my hands upon thee." "Tut, tut!" said the burly ruffler, interposing in time to save the king, and emphasizing this service by knocking Hobbs down with his fist. "Hast respect for neither kings nor rufflers? And thou insult my presence so again, I'll hang thee up myself." Then he said to his majesty, "Thou must make no threats against thy mates, lad, and thou must guard thy tongue from saying evil of them elsewhere. Be king if it please thy mad humor, but be not harmful in it. Sink the title thou hast uttered. 'Tis treason. We be bad men in some few trifling ways, but none among us is so base as to be traitor to his king. We be loving and loyal hearts in that regard. Note if I speak truth. Now, all together, long live Edward, King of England. Long live Edward, King of England." The response came with such a thundergust from the motley crew that the crazy building vibrated to the sound. The little king's face lighted with pleasure for an instant, and he slightly inclined his head and said with grave simplicity, "I thank you, my good people." This unexpected result threw the company into convulsions of merriment. When something like quiet was presently come again, the ruffler said firmly, but with an accent of good nature, "Drop it, boy. 'Tis not wise nor well. Humor thy fancy if thou must, but choose some other title." A tinker shrieked out a suggestion. "Foo-Foo the First, King of the Mooncalves." The title took at once, every throat responded, and a roaring shout went up of, "Long live Foo-Foo the First, King of the Mooncalves," followed by hootings, catcalls, and peals of laughter. "Hail him forth and crown him. Robe him, scepter him, throne him." These and 20 other cries broke out at once, and almost before the poor little victim could draw a breath, he was crowned with a tin basin, robed in a tattered blanket, throned upon a barrel, and sceptered with the tinker's soldering iron. Then all flung themselves upon their knees about him, and sent up a chorus of ironical wailings and mocking supplications, whilst they swabbed their eyes with their soiled and ragged sleeves and aprons. "Be gracious to us, O sweet king. Trample not upon thy beseeching worms, O noble majesty. Pity thy slaves and comfort them with a royal kick. Cheer us and warm us with thy gracious rays, O flaming sun of sovereignty. Sanctify the ground with the touch of thy foot, that we may eat the dirt and be ennobled. Deign to spit upon us, O sire, that our children's children may tell of thy princely condescension, and be proud and happy forever. But the humorous tinker made the hit of the evening, and carried off the honors. Kneeling, he pretended to kiss the king's foot, and was indignantly spurned, whereupon he went about begging for a rag to paste over the place upon his face, which had been touched by the foot, saying it must be preserved from contact with the vulgar air, and that he should make his fortune by going on the highway and exposing it to view at the rate of 100 shillings a sight. He made himself so killingly funny that he was the envy and admiration of the whole mangy rabble. Tears of shame and indignation stood in the little monarch's eyes, and the thought in his heart was, "Had I offered them a deep wrong, they could not be more cruel, yet have I proffered naught but to do them a kindness, and it is thus they use me for it." Chapter 18. The Prince with the Tramps. The troop of vagabonds turned out at early dawn and set forward on their march. There was a lowering sky overhead, sloppy ground underfoot, and a winter chill in the air. All gaiety was gone from the company. Some were sullen and silent, some were irritable and petulant, none were gentle-humored, all were thirsty. The ruffler put Jack in Hugo's charge, with some brief instructions, and commanded John Canty to keep away from him, and let him alone. He also warned Hugo not to be too rough with the lad. After a while the weather grew milder, and the clouds lifted somewhat. The troop ceased to shiver, and their spirits began to improve. They grew more and more cheerful, and finally began to chaff each other and insult passengers along the highway. This showed that they were awaking to an appreciation of life and its joys once more. The dread in which their sort was held was apparent in the fact that everybody gave them the road, and took their ribald insolences meekly, without venturing to talk back. They snatched linen from the hedges, occasionally in full view of the owners, who made no protest, but only seemed grateful that they did not take the hedges too. By and by they invaded a small farmhouse and made themselves at home, while the trembling farmer and his people swept the larder clean to furnish a breakfast for them. They chucked the housewife and her daughters under the chin, whilst receiving the food from their hands, and made coarse jests about them, accompanied with insulting epithets and bursts of hoarse laughter. They threw bones and vegetables at the farmer and his sons, kept them dodging all the time, and applauded uproariously when a good hit was made. They ended by buttering the head of one of the daughters who resented some of their familiarities. When they took their leave, they threatened to come back and burn the house over the heads of the family if any report of their doings got to the ears of the authorities. About noon, after a long and weary tramp, the gang came to a halt behind a hedge on the outskirts of a considerable village. An hour was allowed for rest, then the crew scattered themselves abroad to enter the village at different points to ply their various trades. Jack was sent with Hugo. They wandered hither and thither for some time, Hugo watching for opportunities to do a stroke of business, but finding none, so he finally said, "I see naught to steal. It is a paltry place, wherefore we will beg." "We, forsooth, follow thy trade, it befits thee, but I will not beg." "Thou'lt not beg?" exclaimed Hugo, eyeing the king with surprise. "Prithee, since when hast thou reformed?" "What dost thou mean?" "Mean? Hast thou not begged the streets of London all thy life?" "I? Thou idiot! Spare thy compliments, thy stock will last the longer. Thy father says thou hast begged all thy days. Mayhap he lied. Peradventure you will even make so bold as to say he lied," scoffed Hugo. "Him you call my father? Yes, he lied. Come, play not thy merry game of madman so far, mate. Use it for thy amusement, not thy hurt, and I tell him this, he will scorch thee finely for it. Save thyself the trouble, I will tell him. I like thy spirit, I do in truth, but I do not admire thy judgment. Bone-rackings and bastings be plenty enow in this life, without going out of one's way to invite them. But a truce to these matters. I believe your father. I doubt not he can lie. I doubt not he doth lie upon occasion, for the best of us do that. But there is no occasion here. A wise man does not waste so good a commodity as lying for naught. But come, Sith it is thy humour to give over begging, wherewithal shall we busy ourselves? With robbing kitchens? The king said impatiently, Have done with this folly, you weary me. Hugo replied with temper, Now harkee, mate, you will not beg, you will not rob, so be it. But I will tell you what you will do. You will play decoy whilst I beg, refuse, and you think you may venture. The king was about to reply contemptuously when Hugo said, interrupting, Peace! Here comes one with a kindly face. Now will I fall down in a fit? When the stranger runs to me, set you up a wail, and fall upon your knees, seeming to weep. Then cry out as all the devils of misery were in your belly, and say, O sir, it is my poor afflicted brother, and we be friendless. O God's name, cast through your merciful eyes one pitiful look upon a sick, forsaken, and most miserable wretch. Bestow one little penny out of thy riches upon one smitten of God and ready to perish. And mind you, keep you on wailing, and abate not till we bilk him of his penny, else shall you rue it. Then immediately Hugo began to moan and groan, and roll his eyes, and reel and totter about. And when the stranger was close at hand, down he sprawled before him with a shriek, and began to writhe and wallow in the dirt in seeming agony. Oh dear, cried the benevolent stranger. Oh poor soul, how he doth suffer! There, let me help thee up. O noble sir, forbear, and God love you for a princely gentleman, but it giveth me cruel pain to touch me when I am taken so. My brother there will tell your worship how I am racked with anguish when these fits be upon me. A penny, dear sir, a penny to buy a little food, then leave me to my sorrows. A penny! Thou shalt have 3, thou hapless creature. And he fumbled in his pocket with nervous haste and got them out. There, poor lad, take them, and most welcome. Now come hither, my boy, and help me carry thy stricken brother to yon house where— I am not his brother, said the king, interrupting. What? Not his brother? Oh, hear him, groaned Hugo, then privately ground his teeth. He denies his own brother, and he with 1 foot in the grave. Boy, thou art indeed hard of heart, if this is thy brother. For shame, and he scarce able to move hand or foot. If he is not thy brother, who is he then? A beggar and a thief. He has got your money and has picked your pocket likewise, and thou wouldest do a healing miracle, lay thy staff over his shoulders and trust Providence for the rest. But Hugo did not tarry for the miracle. In a moment he was up and off like the wind, the gentleman following after and raising the hue and cry lustily as he went. The king, breathing deep gratitude to heaven for his own release, fled in the opposite direction and did not slacken his pace until he was out of harm's reach. He took the first road that offered and soon put the village behind him. He hurried along as briskly as he could during several hours, keeping a nervous watch over his shoulder for pursuit, but his fears left him at last, and a grateful sense of security took their place. He recognized now that he was hungry and also very tired. So he halted at a farmhouse, but when he was about to speak, he was cut short and driven rudely away. His clothes were against him. He wandered on, wounded and indignant, and was resolved to put himself in the way of like treatment no more. But hunger is pride's master, so as the evening drew near, he made an attempt at another farmhouse, but here he fared worse than before, for he was called hard names and was promised arrest as a vagrant, except he moved on promptly. The night came on, chilly and overcast, and still the footsore monarch labored slowly on. He was obliged to keep moving, for every time he sat down to rest, he was soon penetrated to the bone with the cold. All his sensations and experiences, as he moved through the solemn gloom and the empty vastness of the night, were new and strange to him. At intervals he heard voices approach, pass by, and fade into silence, and as he saw nothing more of the bodies they belonged to than a sort of formless drifting blur, there was something spectral and uncanny about it all that made him shudder. Occasionally he caught the twinkle of a light, always far away, apparently, almost in another world. If he heard the tinkle of a sheep's bell, it was vague, distant, indistinct. The muffled lowing of the herds floated to him on the night wind in vanishing cadences, a mournful sound. Now and then came the complaining howl of a dog over viewless expanses of field and forest. All sounds were remote. They made the little king feel that all life and activity were far removed from him, and that he stood solitary, companionless in the center of a measureless solitude. He stumbled along through the gruesome fascinations of this new experience, startled occasionally by the soft rustling of the dry leaves overhead, so like human whispers they seemed to sound. And by he came suddenly upon the freckled light of a tin lantern near at hand. He stepped back into the shadows and waited. The lantern stood by the open door of a barn. The king waited some time. There was no sound and nobody stirring. He got so cold, standing still, and the hospitable barn looked so enticing that at last he resolved to risk everything and enter. He started swiftly and stealthily, and just as he was crossing the threshold, he heard voices behind him. He darted behind a cask within the barn and stooped down. 2 farm laborers came in, bringing the lantern with them, and fell to work, talking meanwhile. Whilst they moved about with the light, the king made good use of his eyes and took the bearings of what seemed to be a good-sized stall at the further end of the place, purposing to grope his way to it when he should be left to himself. He also noted the position of a pile of horse blankets midway of the route, with the intent to levy upon them for the service of the Crown of England for one night. By and by the men finished and went away, fastening the door behind them and taking the lantern with them. The shivering king made for the blankets with as good speed as the darkness would allow, gathered them up, and then groped his way safely to the stall. Of 2 of the blankets he made a bed, then covered himself with the remaining 2. He was a glad monarch now, though the blankets were old and thin, and not quite warm enough, and besides gave out a pungent horsey odor that was almost suffocatingly powerful. Although the king was hungry and chilly, he was also so tired and so drowsy that these latter influences soon began to get the advantage of the former, and he presently dozed off into a state of semi-consciousness. Then, just as he was on the point of losing himself wholly, he distinctly felt something touch him. He was broad awake in a moment and gasping for breath. The cold horror of that mysterious touch in the dark almost made his heart stand still. He lay motionless and listened, scarcely breathing. But nothing stirred, and there was no sound. He continued to listen and wait, during what seemed a long time, but still nothing stirred, and there was no sound. So he began to drop into a drowse once more, at last, and all at once he felt that mysterious touch again. It was a grisly thing, this light touch from this noiseless and invisible presence. It made the boy sick with ghostly fears. What should he do? That was the question, but he did not know how to answer it. Should he leave these reasonably comfortable quarters and fly from this inscrutable horror? But fly whither? He could not get out of the barn, and the idea of scurrying blindly hither and thither in the dark, within the captivity of the 4 walls, with this phantom gliding after him and visiting him with that soft, hideous touch upon cheek or shoulder at every turn, was intolerable. But to stay where he was and endure this living death all night, was that better? Number what, then, was there left to do? Ah, there was but one course. He knew it well. He must put out his hand and find that thing. It was easy to think this, but it was hard to brace himself up to try it. 3 times he stretched his hand a little way out into the dark, gingerly, and snatched it suddenly back with a gasp, not because it had encountered anything, but because he had felt so sure it was just going to. But the 4th time, he groped a little further, and his hand lightly swept against something soft and warm. This petrified him nearly with fright. His mind was in such a state that he could imagine the thing to be nothing else than a corpse, newly dead and still warm. He thought he would rather die than touch it again, but he thought this false thought, because he did not know the immortal strength of human curiosity. In no long time his hand was tremblingly groping again, against his judgment and without his consent, but groping persistently on, just the same. It encountered a bunch of long hair. He shuddered, but followed up the hair and found what seemed to be a warm rope, followed up the rope and found an innocent calf, for the rope was not a rope at all but the calf's tail. The king was cordially ashamed of himself for having gotten all that fright and misery out of so paltry a matter as a slumbering calf, but he need not have felt so about it, for it was not the calf that frightened him, but a dreadful non-existent something which the calf stood for. And any other boy, in those old superstitious times, would have acted and suffered just as he had done. The king was not only delighted to find that the creature was only a calf, but delighted to have the calf's company, for he had been feeling so lonesome and friendless that the company and comradeship of even this humble animal were welcome, and he had been so buffeted, so rudely entreated by his own kind, that it was a real comfort to him to feel that he was at last in the society of a fellow creature that had at least a soft heart and a gentle spirit, whatever loftier attributes might be lacking. So he resolved to waive rank and make friends with the calf, while stroking its sleek, warm back, for it lay near him and within easy reach. It occurred to him that this calf might be utilized in more ways than one, whereupon he rearranged his bed, spreading it down close to the calf. Then he cuddled himself up to the calf's back, drew the covers up over himself and his friend, and in a minute or two was as warm and comfortable as he had ever been in the downy couches of the regal palace of Westminster. Pleasant thoughts came at once. Life took on a cheerfuller seeming. He was free of the bonds of servitude and crime, free of the companionship of base and brutal outlaws. He was warm, he was sheltered. In a word, he was happy. The night wind was rising. It swept by in fitful gusts that made the old barn quake and rattle. Then its forces died down at intervals and went moaning and wailing around corners and projections. But it was all music to the king, now that he was snug and comfortable. Let it blow and rage, let it batter and bang, let it moan and wail. He minded it not, he only enjoyed it. He merely snuggled the closer to his friend in a luxury of warm contentment and drifted blissfully out of consciousness into a deep and dreamless sleep that was full of serenity and peace. The distant dogs howled, the melancholy kine complained, and the winds went on raging, whilst furious sheets of rain drove along the roof. But the majesty of England slept on, undisturbed, and the calf did the same, it being a simple creature, and not easily troubled by storms or embarrassed by sleeping with a king. This concludes the 7th part of 13 total of The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.